So good afternoon. My name is Casey Keene. I'm the Director of Programs and Prevention for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I also lead the Adult Children Exposed to Domestic Violence Leadership Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our third webinar in our Speakers Initiative Webinar Series on speaking to our relationships with those who abuse. This has been a topic that people have been really interested in since we started our Speakers Initiative. And even those who don't identify as adult children exposed, who wish to tell their stories, are interested in the way that we talk about those who use violence. So before I introduce today's panelists, who are members of the ACB Steering Committee, I'd like to share a bit about the work that we're engaged in together. So I want to start by sharing our We Stand statement. This is from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, of which we are a project. This statement grounds and guides all that we do. So I'm going to start by reading it. We stand with individuals and groups who have been targeted, degraded, threatened, or marginalized because they are Native Americans, people of color, immigrants, women, Muslims, LGBTQ, or people with disabilities. We stand against white supremacy, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and all other forms of structural oppression. We stand with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, especially those most vulnerable and with limited access to services and protection. We stand together in celebration of the rich diversity of people in this country and the vitality and strength they bring to our communities and society. We stand with those who embrace self-care and community connection as necessary and powerful for social change. And we stand with other activists and organizations who continue to work passionately for gender, racial, economic, and social justice for all. I think it's important to revisit these words because it guides the work that we do, and certainly the work of this project is grounded in these statements, which I think are more important now than ever before. The ACB Leadership Forum is a project of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence that was established to amplify the voices and experiences of adult children exposed to domestic violence to enhance our movement's work. These are faces of many of our 12 current steering committee members, all advocates and change makers in the movement to end gender-based violence who identify as having experienced domestic violence in childhood. We represent diverse backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. Each of our stories is unique and multifaceted. The ACB Speakers Initiative was developed to help build the capacity of adult survivors of children's exposure to share their stories publicly. The initiative includes the Bureau and the development of capacity-building tools, including this guide published last December and available at vonet.org. So if you are interested in joining the ACB Speakers Bureau, please be sure to reach out to me after this webinar and we'll get you connected. And welcome to those of you who are already members and who have been following us through this training series. So this year's webinar series explores key topics and questions that were raised by members of our Speakers Bureau and by participants in our very first Speakers Initiative webinar last year. If you are not able to join us for either of the first two webinars in this series, you can access the recordings and the related materials at vonet.org. And we hope that you'll also be able to join us for our final webinar, Bringing Your Whole Self to Your Work, in March. This series is meant to be responsive to your needs, so please continue to give us feedback and let us know what would be most helpful to you. In fact, we're hoping to have plenty of time for questions today, so we hope that you'll be thinking on those and posing them. For today's discussion, we'll engage with 4 amazing people, all ACB members who bring a unique perspective based on their personal experience as storytellers. So let me tell you a little bit about them. I'd like to welcome David Adams. He is the co-founder and co-director of Emerge, which is the first counseling program in the nation for men who abuse women, established in 1977. Dr. Adams has led Groups for Men Who Batter, and conducted outreach to victims of abuse for 40 years. He has led parenting education classes for fathers for 20 years. He is one of the nation's leading experts on men who batter and has conducted trainings of social service and criminal justice professionals in 46 states and 21 nations. Welcome, David.
Hello.
Hi. Next, I'd like to introduce Lenny Hayes, who participated in one of our previous sessions and truly shared some remarkable insights. Lenny is the owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting, LLC. Lenny has always worked within the Native American community and is currently in private practice, specializing in Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ issues with adults and youth. Lenny is technical assistant and consultant with the Office for Victims of Crime and a sought-after presenter on Native American historical and intergenerational trauma and how it impacts the Native American community, as well as the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community. Welcome, Lenny.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next, we have Ericka Kimball, who's been working on this project with me since its inception. Together, we kind of forged this ground. Ericka is an assistant professor at Portland State University. In addition to conducting research in the area of child exposure to domestic violence, she shares her experiences of domestic violence from childhood to adulthood. She has worked with leading researchers in the field of violence against women and children exposed to domestic violence to develop and implement 2 online training resources to guide practitioners and the general public in supporting children who have been exposed to domestic violence. Welcome, Ericka.
Hello.
Hey. And last but certainly not least, Sheena Morris is the Director of Policy and Community Engagement for the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. In that role, Sheena leads initiatives that engage and mobilize communities around the issue of domestic violence, build relationships between marginalized communities and mainstream systems, and bring together the voices of community-based and mainstream programs working to end violence against women. Welcome, Sheena.
Hi, everyone.
Great. So now, before we turn it over to our panelists, we'd like to learn more about you. So we do have a polling question. Justine, I see that you may be handling some technical issues, but I see you are an amazing multitasker. Thank you so much, Justine. So here's the question we would like to pose to you. When it comes to sharing your story, where are you? And I know we've asked this question at every webinar, but we do have different audiences, and our audiences look different in each one. So maybe put yourself in one of these categories. Are you thinking about it? Are you just writing it down and starting to piece it together? Are you sharing your story in trusted relationships? Have you already told your story in certain public settings? Would you consider yourself experienced with various audiences? Or maybe you could be facilitating this webinar. So let us know where you think along the spectrum you currently are. So hopefully you can all see the results the way I can see them kind of trickling in. And it looks like we have people all across the spectrum. Right now it looks like a majority of people are somewhere in the middle, having shared their story in trusted relationships and maybe in certain public settings. So this is wonderful. No matter where you are, you're in a brave place, and we appreciate you, for going there. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for chiming in, and hopefully this gives our panelists a little idea of where your needs may be as well. So Justine, how do we... Thank you. Justine's a magic maker. All right. So, let's see. So, just to provide some context for the discussion that we're having today, one dynamic that can be especially challenging for people who have not experienced domestic violence to understand is that complex relationship between a person who uses violence and the family members they abuse. Those who have not experienced abuse often describe the choices they would make in such a circumstance without necessarily considering all of the factors that make these relationships so complex. That's why your story can help to shed light on the inner conflict that exists for children exposed to domestic violence, who may both love and hate, or want and reject the person who is choosing to use violence in their home. A common desire that many victims share is to want the person using abuse to simply stop. It's not necessarily about rejecting the person, who is inherently multidimensional with various aspects to their personality that may be appealing or fun or even loving. It is about wanting them to make different choices. In fact, it can be dangerous to paint a picture of a one-dimensional monster in your story. So today's speakers will help us explore this very issue through the lens of our core beliefs that are described on this slide. So our core beliefs that each of us should be allowed and encouraged to name our own experience, and that's why we titled this webinar, Not One Path. Our belief that there's a difference between loving a person who abuses and condoning their behavior, and our belief that violence is learned and reinforced through societal norms, yet accountability and commitment to change can create a new path. So I would say let's jump right into it. So our first topic for our panelists to reflect on is around this idea of humanizing those who abuse. This has been a perspective we've shared in previous trainings that has gotten quite a reaction from people. So we thought it would be helpful to really explore this and say that there are many reasons why this one-dimensional monster narrative is particularly harmful, not only to survivors, but also to the field at large. We have to acknowledge the fact that there's no perpetrator prototype and that abusers are not all the same, and push back against labeling people as criminal, especially in communities of color. So my question to panelists, and I think I'd like to start with Sheena, is why do you feel it's important to humanize those who abuse in our narrative? So Sheena, do you mind starting us off?
All right. Hi, everyone, again. That's a really good question, Casey. For me, it's, humanizing those who abuse or the person who perpetrated abuse against my mother, my father. It was really important to my own healing, my own growth. In these later years when I've begun to do this work, it's really important as to how I support other survivors in my work, and essentially overall how I care for and contribute to the culture of the movement. That to me is why it is important to humanize those who abuse in the narrative that I tell. And then also just continuing the narrative for me around the monster narrative doesn't necessarily serve justice or peace to anyone. And I really try to be mindful as a woman of color to not further contribute to a narrative that may further dehumanize people in my community.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sheena. It makes so much sense. I wonder, Ericka, if you'd like to chime in on this issue.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the reasons it's important to humanize those who abuse is the fact that, and it goes to our next question that we're going to talk to you about too, is the idea of the conflict around messaging around who is like the abuser and who is not. Like if we're going to use that language, I think when we label them a monster, I think especially for me growing up and still having a relationship with my father who uses battering tactics and has battering behaviors, is the idea of like, it was hard for me to reconcile, like I love him even though he's done these bad things, and when people label him as just bad, it's hard for me to explain how I still love him and to explain how I'm still attached to him and can see some of the good in him. And I feel like it's a discounting of our relationship. Not necessarily that our relationship's always positive, but I think to just put it into like one box was always very confusing for me as a kid, and is really confusing to me as a person who works in this movement. When people want to put my dad in one box and then doesn't understand that there's this whole conflict in terms of like, while my dad uses all these behaviors, there are times when he's very loving and supportive too. And I think that's actually part of the conflict of growing up in homes like this, is that we it's not just this one way. It's not always bad. And there is complexity in the ways that this plays out in our families.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really critical. It's important for people to understand that. And I feel like the stories of kids who live in these homes can really shed light on those complexities themselves, and those being able to hold two feelings or multiple feelings about the abuser at one time. So I wonder, David or Lenny, if you'd like to chime in, or we can move to the next question. Any additional thoughts on this?
Well, this is Lenny, and coming from a cultural perspective, I'm Native American, and so when I think about when we dehumanize individuals who impose violence on individuals in any realm, when it comes to child abuse, domestic violence, all of that, I think when we do that, for me, this is my own personal opinion, is that if I was to do that, I would also, what I'm doing is that I'm also preventing that person from healing. I'm all about helping individuals heal from trauma, and even perpetrators. But what I always say, too, is that we have to invite the individuals to the table when they are ready to heal. Sometimes I think we can be too forceful. But again, this is my personal opinion, and that's what I would like to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's interesting to think about it from a number of different perspectives on how harmful that monster label can be, not only to the victims, but to that person themselves, and then also how that narrative kind of tends to drive our efforts as advocates, and how the ways in which advocates can kind of echo that narrative back to victims, who then internalize it and maybe push back against it, maybe feel conflicted about it, but maybe feel like they can't or shouldn't. So, so any additional thoughts from any of our panelists on humanizing those who abuse before we move to the next topic?
Well, this is David. All I would say is that I've worked with abusers for 42 years now, and part of what I've learned is that they aren't just abusers, and so I mean they're real, full people in every sense of the word, and so my working with them, really requires me to kind of focus on that, and to really think about them as people, rather than just as objectifying them as abusers.
Yeah, thank you, David. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next topic. Still a lot to explore there. And this is specific to speaking to the fears of becoming like the abuser, which is something that Ericka started to raise. And it's a very common experience, I think, for those of us who've experienced domestic violence in childhood. So one of the reasons that we do push back against this monster narrative is because of the impact it can have on children exposed, especially when it comes to the risk of internalizing the idea that when they are genetically linked, that they might see themselves as part monster or somehow genetically predisposed to becoming like them. The children's fears of becoming like the abuser can carry through adulthood and can sometimes require proactive efforts on our part to monitor and resist these behaviors in ourselves. So I'd like to pose this question to the panel. What has your experience taught you about the ways that these fears can surface for children exposed to domestic violence across the lifespan? And let's start with Lenny.
Well, for me, coming from a space of a lot of trauma, not only experiencing and seeing domestic violence, but also being a survivor of child sexual abuse, physical abuse, and mental and emotional abuse. For me, when I went on my healing journey, I had to heal a lot of what happened to me, and today I still have to, even though it's been quite a number of years that I've been out of therapy, but one of the things that I keep in mind is that I also have to keep myself intact in regards to that I don't lash out at members of my family or even my partner, because, we do learn behaviors that happen to us when we're abused or when we see abusive behavior. So there's been many times where I've actually went and did check-ins in therapy because I discovered one time that I was verbally abusing my partner and didn't even know it until I walked into Barnes & Noble and this book jumped out on me, which was titled The Verbally Abusive Relationship. And then I opened it up and looked at the characteristics and I said, oh my God, I'm abusing Brian. For me, I'm always mindful about checking in with myself and where I'm at and making sure that I don't expose others to abusive behavior.
I just want to acknowledge your bravery in sharing that, Lenny, and to say that I myself can say that that's been an experience for me as well, because I think it's important to acknowledge that, abuse is learned behavior, and so when we learn this behavior, it almost takes, you have to be intentional and proactive about unlearning those things and not behaving in those ways, and I certainly have recognized abusive behaviors in myself along the way, and so I think that that's a common experience. So I don't know if others on the panel would like to offer, their experiences as well when it comes to this. Ericka, is there anything you'd like to reflect on here?
Yeah, I think what I would share is that I think, like Lenny was saying and what you're saying, Casey, is that this is really an ongoing process of balancing the internalizing that we are part monster, and I think it's reinforced. Like in my family, I talk about, like in my family, I was really raised, and it was repeatedly said, and even as an adult, I'm always told that I'm just like my dad, just like my dad, just like my dad. And if I'm angry, that I'm just like my dad in the ways that I handle my anger. And so I think it's a constant process, and for me to understand that anger, number one, is an okay emotion and feeling to have, and that it doesn't equal abuse, but also being like aware, like Lenny and Casey, like both of you said, of like sometimes our response in anger can be abusive. And so it's constantly always having to check in with that, both with ourselves in terms of like, is my behavior, what's driving my behavior? Is it a control issue that I'm trying to do? Am I actually having hurt feelings? Am I frustrated? What is it that's controlling the anger feelings that's resulting in the behavior, whether it's a lashing out in an abusive way, or the other thing that I do if I'm not lashing out, is that I also will stuff or deny the feelings because I'm not sure how to handle them. And so I think it's a constant, I don't want to say struggle, because I actually don't think it's a negative thing necessarily, but it's a constant awareness of how you're feeling, potentially negative or explosive feelings. And so just really being aware that anger doesn't equal abusive, and that it's okay to be angry. And then it's a matter of like, how do we manage our anger with our families, with our friends, and then being able to check ourselves, but also having people around us who we can check in with. And that can hold up a mirror and say like, hey, like the way that you're responding to this is not okay. And then be able to take that and going, oh, yes. And then not holding on to this idea, because I think one of the places I go to personally is that if someone goes back out going like, hey, how you respond to that felt really abusive or felt mean, I go, see, I'm just like my dad. I'm just like my dad. I'm that monster. And so I think it's a constant ongoing process of getting rid of the internalization of being a monster and saying that anger is okay, and then sometimes the way that we respond to the anger is not okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Ericka. Any other thoughts on this idea of internalizing, these as part of, a consequence of this monster narrative from the panelists?
Hey, Casey, this is Sheena. Yeah, just, what it shared makes with me very, similar feel, just balancing that constant check-in with myself, as it relates to how I may parent my own child or how I'm in relationship with a partner. Doing that constant check-in is kind of multi-layered, as everyone has mentioned, because you're constantly checking in with yourself, doing that self-check. And so, yeah, that for me is a common thing as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Sheena. Any additional thoughts before we move to the next topic? Okay. So this next one is a big one. And I'm so glad that, we decided to frame this webinar as not one path, because I think that that's sort of a critical concept when it comes to understanding the differences in each of our relationships with those who perpetrated abuse, and also on our path to forgiveness, in the ways we think about forgiveness, in the ways that we have approached accountability. And so I want to say that accountability and forgiveness are really separate, yet intertwined concepts. And really they can look different for each individual. I think what's important is to really examine your own thoughts and feelings related to forgiveness and understand that there's no right answer and there's no one path that works for everyone. But a lot of times, when I'm out there speaking to my story, I do get asked questions about forgiveness, and it's a topic that comes up a lot. So I think it's important for those of us who are out there telling our story to visit this topic with, sit with it and really try to think about, your feelings and thoughts around it. So I wonder if we can start, let's start with David. And my question is, what are your thoughts on accountability and forgiveness when it comes to those who have done harm to us?
Thank you. When I think about my own family, I kind of see examples in my siblings of forgiveness and unforgiveness, and I think, like, for instance, one of my sisters, has totally forgiven our father, and I think she's paid kind of an enormous price for it. I mean, I should add, my father has never really taken responsibility for his abusive behavior, and he still acts like a bully, towards her and towards the nursing staff where he lives, and I feel like my sister has kind of sacrificed her whole life, for him, and it's like she's still kind of yearning for his approval. And as a result, I think she's never really kind of launched herself. On the other extreme, I have a brother who totally doesn't forgive my father and is very angry and has been kind of abusive in his relationships. And so kind of even in the same family, I kind of see both extremes. And for myself, I feel like I haven't forgiven my father and I haven't unforgiven him. I kind of like, just my attitude is, he just is who he is, basically. And then I just sort of move on to, what kind of relationship I choose to have with him, basically, which is fairly limited, but part of it is sort of determined by my sister, who still has lots of contact with him, and it would be very hurtful for me not to have any contact with my father. And really, so it's for her sake that I still visit my father. And I'm also mindful that if I were to express my feelings more directly towards my father, he would probably take that out on her, too. So there's that kind of dynamic of having to think about each other, still, and so none of us sort of have feelings just in isolation of each other. It has an impact on all of us.
David, I think that's such an important point, and I'm so glad you're raising that, about the fact that even if we feel a certain way about that individual relationship that we may have with the person causing harm, that it's really impacted by a whole family system. And so we may not be able to act upon, our own feelings and be able to guide that relationship in the way that we want because we feel the impact of the other members of the family. And so I think that that's particularly an important point. Thank you for raising that. I see Ericka nodding her head. It makes me want to call on you, Ericka. Did you have something to share?
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm going to answer every question, and I'm going to try not to. I was thinking about this. There's a Rabbi, Dana Ruttenberg, who wrote a New York Times editorial on the idea of, and she did this during Yom Kippur, and she talked about the repentance, forgiveness, and I'm going to forget the third one. That's fine. I'm just going to really go for forgiveness. And that forgiveness is really within our, the perpetrator needs to repent on their own, and the forgiveness is upon the victim. And I don't necessarily want to use that language, but just thinking about, forgiveness is on us. And I loved what David said is that I haven't necessarily forgiven my father. He's still active in his behaviors, much like David. And so it's not as though that I've forgiven him, but I've forgiven this idea of I think I've come to this place where I feel like I don't need to have it make sense to me to rationalize that I have a relationship with him. He's never going to be accountable for his behaviors. I'm never going to condone them, and we can figure out how this messiness looks like. And I just don't he's ever going to get to that place of repentance or accountability, but I don't think I need to rely on that for me to forgive the situations and not carry it with me.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It really does. It really does make sense. Thank you. Lenny, I'm going to ask you to chime in. I know we've had similar conversations before about that path to forgiveness. I wonder if you can reflect on that.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I like to think about is that I always remind people that we need to keep our perpetrators accountable. For me, forgiveness looks like I have forgiven perpetrators in my life who have caused harm on me, and that forgiveness is not about them, it's about me. Because once I can forgive, then I don't carry anger and shame, all the negative feelings that comes with that with me. And so I'm able to move on with my life. But I've also learned to create healthy boundaries with individuals who perpetrated against me, including family members, where I choose not to have them as part of my life. And it's not about them, it's about me. Because I do have individuals in my family who are perpetrators and still lash out at me. But what I don't do is I don't engage in their behavior. And I don't know if that makes them, it probably even makes them more angrier that I don't engage in their behavior, because I often do hear from other family members what they're saying, or and they're still at a point in their life where they're not healthy. They're still engaging in bad behaviors, but I choose just not to for them to be a part of my life. And so for me, it's my choice in how I forgive people, and I don't expect other people to look at it the way that I do. But for me, once I learned how to forgive people, individuals who perpetrated against me and against my biological mother, who I grew up seeing things that a child should never have seen. And then my mother became a perpetrator on me. And so to this day, and I don't talk about her in a bad way. I always tell people that. I look at it in a Native American lens, where I still love my mother, even though she was one of my perpetrators, one of my main perpetrators, actually. And the way I see it is that she gave birth to me. I still love her. She gave me life, and that's a good thing. But that's all she gave me. She taught me bad things. And so it's okay for me to say that because I'm at a point in my life where I haven't talked to my biological mother for 20 years, and it was by my choice. Nobody forced me to do that. Nobody talked me into doing that. I've had relatives who would say, well, you need to talk to her. She's your... And I've had to tell people, no, that I choose not to do that because she's not healthy. So for me, it's all making healthy choices and healthy boundaries.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lenny. Sheena, what are your thoughts on accountability and forgiveness?
Well, I think, they are just like everyone else has shared that, for me, forgiveness is one of those things that it's complex and it's always evolving. Especially, like I said, in my case, my father also suffers from mental illness. And so, that for me has kind of further complicated the idea around forgiveness sometimes and just navigating how that all looks, as well as the accountability piece. There are times or have been times across my lifespan where community accountability has been enough, and then there may have been times when there was a more in-depth response that was needed from like a criminal justice system. So it's just one of those things that's constantly evolving, both forgiveness and accountability. It's just always changing for me across the lifespan. It's always been that way.
Yeah. I also want to bring some voice to those of us who choose not to forgive. I know several of you have shared, your choice for forgiveness, and I have read on the topic and explored it myself, and I know that for many, finding forgiveness, and as Ericka said, it's for the victim, right? It's an act of liberation. Freeing yourself from the anger and the pain. But I know that there are many who choose to hold on to that anger for various reasons. And one thing that's really clear to me from all of you sharing is just how different, how complex each of those relationships is, how many factors there are to consider. So I really appreciate each of you sharing kind of your personal experiences with this and how it's determined your path going forward. Because it's not straightforward, it's not simple, and it's not easy. But I think that no matter where you are in this process, it's just helpful to be mindful about defining that for yourself. So any additional thoughts on accountability and forgiveness before we move to the next topic? So then I'll move on and say that, and this came up in a couple of your stories around navigating and speaking truth to ongoing family dynamics. So a lot of times we make the assumption that once kids exposed to domestic violence have grown up, that they are somehow free of the abuse or that that's in the past. And the reality is that many of us may have ongoing relationships with those who have done harm, and that even when we might be separated from them, it doesn't necessarily mean the violence has stopped, and that in many cases, we share our stories knowing that we're still actively engaged in strategizing for our own well-being, as well as the safety of our victim parent, and, as David raised, considering the dynamics between siblings. And so there's a lot to say in that when we're sharing our stories of childhood exposure, we often talk about it as being in the past. But the reality is that many of us in adulthood still carry these stories, to this day and are still navigating those dynamics. So I wonder if our panelists can reflect on how your story is shaped by the fact that you may still be navigating violence and abuse. Sheena, I know we just heard from you, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind getting us started.
Sure. So for me, it's only most recently that I am even more kind of vocal about my childhood experience because I, for many years, up until maybe about 5 years ago, did very well have to really be mindful of where I shared information, how I shared information, because my father still lived in the same community as my mother and would very well use certain tactics to intimidate her. That's not necessarily so much of an issue now as my mother has relocated and my father has too. But yeah, I mean, like I said, for me, it's just one of those things where I may not have shared so much across the years. I recall, even having to safety plan on my wedding day. I remember sitting down with my wedding coordinator and asking her about the seating arrangements and how nervous I was on that day about walking down the aisle and then to get into the room and realize that my parents are sitting on the same side. And, people may have thought that I was, caught up in the moment or nervous, but no, in actuality, I'm thinking about my parents are sitting on the same side. What is the safety of my mother in that moment? So I think it's to your point, Casey, people assume that once the violence, maybe physical violence, has stopped in childhood, that the person isn't experiencing anything else across their lifespan. But the reality is that you may very well be always navigating safety throughout the remainder of your lifespan.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheena. Lenny, what are your thoughts on speaking truth to these ongoing family dynamics? And Lenny, you may be muted if you're speaking. We can't hear you.
Well, that's a huge question. But when I think, I do have family members who are still perpetrating. But like I said earlier, I mean, I have connection with only certain individuals in my family, and individuals who have gone through some form of healing or are still going through their healing. I always say I'm still going through my healing too because of what I experienced as a child, multiple different types of trauma. And so I really stay connected with the individuals who are healthy. I don't play a part with individuals in my family who are not healthy because it does me no good. And often I believe, too, that when you're in a place of healing and you're around other individuals who are toxic or unhealthy, you become a threat to them. And they will often lash out even more at you. So I try to avoid situations where I'm not around those individuals. Like what I was saying earlier about my biological mother, that was a choice that I made because she never experienced any type of healing. I don't hate her for not doing that, but that's her choice. I can't force her to heal, and I can't force her to admit to the things that she did wrong or any of my perpetrators. I just know that what I experienced as a child was unhealthy, and I should have never experienced any of that. I should have never seen the things that I've seen. But I still keep individuals accountable who have caused harm, not only on me, but other individuals. And one of the things that, from my experience as a Native person and the healing that I have done and my connection to culture and spirituality, I always keep in mind what an elder has said to me one time. She told me, she said, the Creator puts those people in front of you to remind you not to be that way. So that's a valuable lesson in what I've learned from my own experience and navigating through family and community. But I always remind people these are my thoughts. I don't expect people to believe the way that I believe, but I guess this is my way of survival.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with the disconnection, if that makes sense, with family. It hurts at times, but this is what I can do for myself, because I'm always all about self-care too. So.
Well, Lenny, and what I'm hearing is that not only is it self-protective and in the interest of your own health and well-being, but it also feels very respectful. And kind of hearing the words that you use when you talk about those who have done, it feels like it's a respectful approach for their well-being as well as for yours.
Yes, and I think that goes back to the topic of humanizing individuals. And that's where my thought is. And like I said, we all have our different ways, and like you even said, we all have our ways of either we're going to forgive or we're not going to forgive. That's our own individual choice.
Yeah. Thank you, Lenny. How about David? David, what would you say? Because you shared that you are continuing to navigate these ongoing dynamics, and how do you speak truth to that experience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is going to really sound terrible, but I'm probably going to feel guilty about this later. But I kind of resent the fact that my father is still alive. I mean, he's 85, and and my mother died at age 43. And so partly as a result of my father, and it just sort of continues to seem so unfair, that he is in our lives and my mother is not in our lives. And I also feel that just by virtue of the fact that he's still alive, he's still dictating the kind of relationship that I have with my sisters and my brother. I think we'd be a lot closer, if it weren't for kind of the feelings that we all have and the different kind of survival strategies that we've kind of developed. And I think my sister, who kind of continues to feel so responsible for him, really resents me and my other siblings for not stepping up to the level that she steps up to, and kind of relentlessly guilt trips kind of the rest of us, and kind of openly compares, how much money I give to her and compared to my sister, and that kind of thing. So and so it kind of reverberates through everybody's family. My wife gets upset at me sometimes that she gets upset at my sister for being such a guilt tripper, of me, and yet I still have a relationship with my sister, and I still love her, and so it kind of reverberates through all of our families, and I feel like my father still kind of dictates that just by virtue of the fact that he's still alive, and I guess the other thing is that I have real survivor guilt because, my life has gone so much better, than my siblings, and so I just sort of feel really badly for them, basically, and yet kind of powerless to help them, too. And so I think I'm always going to feel, some guilt for that.
Yeah. Thank you for your bravery in sharing that with us, David. I really appreciate it. I know that you're not alone in those feelings. And just thinking about the power and control that your father has just by virtue of his living is that must be a really challenging thing to just reconcile, especially given, the work that you do. I can imagine how heavy that feels. I wonder if, Ericka, if you had any additional reflections on this, as I know you're still navigating these dynamics as well.
Yeah, I think one of the attendees had posted kind of a comment around the idea of like, even if the behaviors aren't necessarily, if someone's not actually perpetrating the violence, that there's still so much high rates of PTSD, and that family dynamics themselves can trigger some of those feelings. And I was thinking about how does this impact my story? How do I navigate all of this, knowing what I know, the work that I do. And just at Thanksgiving, I had everybody at my house. My dad was pretty elevated. You know, you could feel some of the tension. And it's been a long time since he's perpetrated physical violence, but he's still very emotionally explosive. And my nephew is also very emotionally explosive. And the two of them started kind of picking at each other, and then all of us kind of went right into our roles in terms of like, how do we manage this? And it escalated to the point of having to get my nephews to leave because they were starting to get physical with each other, and I didn't want my dad, like it was like in order to keep my dad not to escalate any further to perpetrate harm on my nephews, and while my nephews were laterally harming one another, I'm in this role of like, okay, separation, like you all need to go because we need to keep dad happy so that this doesn't end up into like a bigger explosive fight. And then as a result of that, like every single one of us is having this kind of our own like kind of interact or like trigger back into like how we were in childhood, where you know, like my older sister who isolates, I go into peacekeeping mode, I have another sister who lashes out in anger, so we're like all in our roles, and it's like, and I'm watching this happen, and I know like I'm gonna come speak about this in 2 months, and this is like happening before my eyes. And so I think it's like it's one of those kind of surreal things. And I think what's hard, and I think about this specifically around the idea of like PTSD or any type of like trauma, and the ways that we disassociate. And I have a tendency to like I over intellectualize, like I will analyze it and make it real up here to keep myself from it. And so it's just like to be able to tell the story, I have to separate myself from it. But like I remember exactly like what it felt like to be in the role, and then like literally watching. It's like this real surreal experience.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're raising that. Actually, it's a perfect segue to our next topic, which is kind of about managing that dual identity. But also, I think you make an excellent point about kind of the family roles that we fall into that sort of were assigned or that we took on, you know, since childhood, and how it's easy to fall into that familiar family structure, and all play the roles that we're I don't know, that we're used to playing. So before I move on to that kind of dual identity topic, I don't know if anybody had additional thoughts along the way as we've been talking about this idea of managing and speaking truth to these ongoing family dynamics. So any other thoughts that came up for people?
This is Sheena. I mean, this is like the perfect segue, because just listening to Ericka, like you just fall back into that role of like being the fixer. And for me, I have another sibling, but we don't have the same father. So in the moment that I was talking about at my wedding, I forgot my mother was actually walking with me down the aisle. I'm in that moment, just as you described, Ericka, trying to be the fixer and move my mother over further away from my father. So you just, like you said, you revert to those roles that seem to be the norm from childhood for you.
Right.
I just, this is Lenny. Yeah, what I wanted to say was I was really happy that David said that, because often I experience that survival guilt when, for me, I got healthy, but yet I have other siblings who have not gotten healthy. But to keep myself looking at it in a human lens, I still feel bad for them. Doesn't mean that I don't care about them, but I do love my siblings. But, you know, these were behaviors that we were taught as children. And so I tried to model the best behavior that I possibly could in front of my siblings or other family members in regards to violence, and how I present it and how I talk to them about it. Doesn't mean they have to be like me, but it's hard. It's really, really hard. I mean, These are my siblings. These are my relatives who are suffering, who haven't found their space of healing. So I still feel for them, but I do like what David said. For me, I also carry that survival guilt.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lenny. So let's talk about these dual identities, because I think that's something that's just a common thing that everybody on the ACB steering committee has in common, is that we have this dual identity of survivor and advocate. We have siblings and other survivors in our families, though, who may have followed a different path. And so this reality, I think, sometimes helps to shed light on this distinct lens that advocacy work brings, and the ways that that lens tends to impact our relationships with those who have done us harm, and also with our siblings, and also with our victim parents. And so I guess I want to give some time for us to really think through how this dual identity, so how our advocacy work and our storytelling work has really impacted our relationships with family members. Because, I think Ericka gives a perfect example of how, you're seeing this unfolding right before your eyes. You know exactly what's happening. You have all the words for it. You have the analysis for it. You could teach on it, right? Yet it's your experience. So, Ericka, do you want to start us out?
Sure. So the question really is, how does our advocacy work and storytelling impact our relationship with our family, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the things is that most of my family doesn't even know that I speak on this or that I do work around this. I have 2 areas of work that I do, and my family understands one of them, and I never share this really with my larger family. My partner and my children know this, and my sisters do at some levels. I have a sister who's also an advocate. She's a sexual assault advocate, and our relationship with this work is very different. And with our storytelling is very different. And so I think that it impacts our relationships where I think I really feel like I can do the separation and I still fall in line. And I get frustrated when I see myself fall in line and I see all them fall in line. But I also just don't share that I do this work, or that I'm very, this side of my life to them is no one talks about it. My sisters know I do a little bit about it, but we never talk about the work that I do in this place. And when I also share my story, I try to really only share my story from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Ericka, how about you, Sheena?
Yeah, for me, my family on my mother's side, they're very aware about the work that I do, and are becoming more aware with me being more vocal about my experience in childhood. My family on my father's side does not necessarily know as much, nor does my father really have a sense of the work that I do. But I find myself, because I'm in contact more with my mother's side of the family. Like you said, Casey, you have this analysis around things, and you can really explain things more in depth. And I find myself doing a lot of that with my mother's family, really kind of speaking from that place and using my experience to kind of deepen their analysis around why or how they may look at somebody else who may be experiencing violence.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I promised I wouldn't call any panelists out necessarily, but I do wonder, David, I'm going to do it anyway. I wonder, David, if you had any additional reflections because of what you've shared so far today on kind of how your work, especially this work that you've done, that you've spent your life doing around working with batterers has impacted these relationships and has shaped kind of the family dynamics and how you speak to them?
Well, I guess I'm kind of like Sheena and Ericka in that I haven't really, I don't talk about it a lot with my family, you know, and you know, I think my father totally doesn't make the connection about what I do and himself. I mean, he, you know,
Right.
that's completely lost on him.
Okay.
And so I think my kind of appreciate what I do, but I don't know that they really connect it at all. And I kind of separate what I do professionally with kind of how I tell my story too. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel nervous. I mean, it's hard to sort of talk about myself without talking about my siblings, you know, too. And yet I want to be respectful to them, you know, too, and kind of respect that they have their own perspective. You know, I don't think that they would agree at all with, you know, some of them, at least with my perspective. And so it's tricky, you know, and unfortunately they're not kind of in the field. And so there's very little chance that they would kind of know how I tell my story, you know, either. Yeah, I mean, I you know, it's funny because I feel so confident in working with abusers, and yet I feel so unconfident, you know, in how I deal with my family.
Yeah, and I don't think that's an uncommon experience. I think that many of us feel that way too. And there may even be sort of an additional layer of pressure on those of us who identify as advocates, right, to have it right or to know the answers or to do it the right way when, you know, really acknowledging the humanity of this experience and the pain is really, really critical.
Casey, I wanted to say real quick, I think for me, one of the fortunate things for me in sharing with my family or telling my story is that I haven't been kind of like shunned or, you know, disowned or anything like that by my family. But when I think about kind of sometimes the cultural dynamics of the community that I identify from, how that can very much be a thing in the Black and African American community, that you don't tell your business. And so, you know, I'm fortunate that has not necessarily been an experience for me in sharing my story or holding back and having these conversations with families. But I do recognize that can sometimes be a challenge for other child survivors who may want to share.
Yeah. No, I so appreciate you raising that because that adds, like, it further complicates the choice that you're making, and it really then seems to be a loyalty issue, right? So, and loyalty issues are something that we're actually really well versed in when it comes to simply our experiences of surviving abuse and abusive parents. So, yeah, I really appreciate you raising the additional layer that brings, and the additional risk that some survivors take when sharing their stories. Other thoughts on this dual identity that any panelists want to chime in with?
Well, I just wanted to say that my family knows the work that I do, my advocacy work in different areas. And I have a close relationship with my older sister, and what I like is that her and I are able to talk about the violence that occurred in our life because we both support one another. We both have feelings for other siblings who haven't really basically come forward to talk about what their experience was like. So I like the fact that I have that connection with my older sister because it also keeps me human. It helps me to not have to push everything under the carpet and deny everything that happens. And I also like what Sheena said too. Coming from the Native American community, we're taught for many reasons to keep silent in a lot of the issues that impacts our community, and violence is one of them. I always tell my sister, and when I go out and present and tell my story, I tell people that I do this so that I can help others create their own voice, giving themselves permission to tell their stories. Because, right now, what we're doing is we are being so vulnerable to people that we don't even know are people we can't even see. But we're able to have this conversation because I don't think we have this conversation often. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think you also raised, an important point about our relationships with our siblings. And I think one of the questions I get when I share my story is about, whether my siblings know that I'm sharing this, whether they are on board with it, kind of like what's the dynamic there. And I think that it's important for us to address that and speak to that because it helps drive home that point that we try to make, that even in the same household, siblings' experiences will be different, that we don't all have the same experience, even if we experience day-to-day the exact same thing, and that each of our stories are different, each of our paths are different, and so I think that, and sort of shedding light on that is really important, and the fact that, our paths to healing are different, that there's not any assumptions that you can make, right, about any one child exposed to domestic violence and the path that they're on. Thank you. So there is, some active chatting happening. So I really appreciate those of you who are chiming in the text chat, and I would encourage you to continue to do so. The last topic that we have to address before we move on to Q&A is around healing and self-care. And I know it has come up in many of the questions that we've talked through already. But I just want to say that throughout this series, we've really emphasized the importance of prioritizing your well-being throughout the storytelling process. And today, what we're stressing is the importance of creating and maintaining boundaries with and caring for family members along the way. And certainly Lenny has spoken to this. And I wonder if our panelists have any advice to offer when it comes to attending to your wellness, especially when it comes to having these conversations around our perpetrators. So, David, can we start with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess what I think of is I think about when I visit my father, which is probably about once a month, and I kind of dread the experience, and I kind of like have to plan for the visit to kind of just get myself through it, basically, and so I think kind of what is difficult about it is that my father's approval is still important to me, and the way it plays out, though, is that my father is still very kind of angry, towards my sister, who's, sacrificed her whole life for him, and he's become quite racist also towards the nursing home staff, and so it sort of feels like the only way you could get his approval is by agreeing with him, and obviously I don't want to do that, and so my strategy is to distract him, and so because I don't want to get into it with him, because it's not like he'll agree with me either, and then he'll take it out on my sister, if I confront him about what he's saying, and so what I do is that I'll sort of prepare these YouTube videos in advance of every visit. Like I'll just sort of research topics that I know he's interested in, like truck crashes or trucks getting caught under bridges, or Guilty dogs. That's another one he really likes. So he really likes these YouTube videos of guilty dogs, and so, I mean, he's lying in bed because he's lost both of his legs, and so I'm basically holding my iPad up to him, showing him these videos, and then just sort of counting up the time as I'm doing that, until the 2 hours has passed, and so it just sort of gets me through it, basically, and so I guess the message is that, I think the importance of setting limits and the importance of kind of like, recognizing what you can do and what you can't do, basically, and so that's kind of how I get myself through kind of a visit with my father, and sort of save my own soul in the process. I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, David. How about Lenny? What are your reflections and advice, I guess?
Well, self-care comes in many, many different ways. For me, being a survivor of many things, I don't have an issue or a problem with doing a check-in with a therapist, even when I'm a therapist. I don't have the answers, and I have to tell a story of when I went into therapy, and I said to my therapist, "Oh, well, I should have known that." And her response to me was, "Well, how would you have known that when you were stuck in the middle of it?" And I was like, "You're right." So often, like I said, I do self-care in many, many different ways. It's really important, and I don't have an issue with continuously healing, because I believe I'm going to heal for the rest of my life just because of what I experienced, and I'm okay with that. And so I check in with my therapist, my friends, my older sister, people who are important to me, to help me through any struggles and challenges, because I do have a lot of struggles and challenges. And, it hasn't been until probably the last, I would say 8 years, that I've really have grown to experiencing that child within, taking care of that little boy. I'm always reminded that when he comes out to play, it's okay. I don't have to shame him. Because I do act childish sometimes with my partner, or I act like a child, which is fun. But when you grow up in a family where there's a lot of dysfunction, often people say to you, "Don't act like that. You shouldn't act like that. You're not supposed to act like that." But now I allow myself to act like that, and I'm okay with it. So, like I said, self-care comes in many, many different ways for me.
Oh, I love that. That's actually I haven't heard that one before. I've heard a lot of advice on self-care, but not the permissiveness with yourself, in being playful and sort of reclaiming childhood in that small way. So I really appreciate that. Ericka or Sheena, is there any additional advice you'd offer when it comes to healing and self-care?
This is Sheena. I think I do, similar things that both Lenny and David have mentioned, as far as self-care. I use a lot of humor. People will tell you that I'm really silly. I love to make other people laugh. And for me, having other people laugh is also taking care of myself in those moments. And then I also try to be very intentional about how I do remain in contact and engage with my father. So for me, that looks like now as I begin to build my own family, and, my father having the opportunity to see my son, it may be through sending him picture books of my son, or, just sending a photo around the holidays. So I've learned different ways to still engage with him, but ways that are going to also not cause me further harm.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Ericka, anything else before we move to the next?
The only thing I would add, and I think this builds on what many have said, is that I've been working on trying to figure out, like as I'm trying to create boundaries while I'm also trying to care for family members. I think like my parents are aging and stuff like that. I'm trying to be really aware of how many things am I doing out of trying to get love from them or to believe that I'm trying to control the situation versus like what is it that needs to be done, what do I want to do, and then what are the other drivers that are forcing my behavior, and thinking clearly about that. Like, am I trying to achieve something that's that I can't achieve, and then reconciling like, do I still want to do it or not? So I think just like being clear on like what boundaries I'm setting and why I'm setting them.
Right. Thank you. Wonderful. Oh, and I also want to share, so Brecken posed the same question in the text chat about what do we do to take care of ourselves, and I appreciate Jessica sharing that she dresses nice. So she says, I try to dress in a way that feels empowering, and honestly, sometimes I lean towards wearing shawls or ponchos because it feels like wrapping myself up in a blanket. And she said, not only is it comfy, but it's also fancy, and people always think you're going the extra mile with a dress or poncho, but they don't know it's really because you want to be comfy. So yeah, self-care does come in all kinds of forms, and we really appreciate you sharing that. So in conclusion, before we move on to your questions, if you have them, and please, pose your questions to the panelists, we want you to know that we really honor your path and your truth, and that no matter what it looks like for you, that we acknowledge that it takes courage to bring voice to your experience. So we appreciate and honor the courage that you are demonstrating by bringing your voice to your story. And especially, these challenging parts where, you are trying to shed light for your audience on a very complicated, complex relationship. But that it really is important to do so, so that we can step away from this one-dimensional monster narrative that we have, and the harm that it does to families and to our whole helping system. So we'd like to take questions. I know I have a question that I thought of, while we were talking, and it's really this, to our panelists. When telling your childhood story, or telling your story, do you keep it in the past and just talk about, it as what happened in your childhood, or do you share these ongoing experiences of navigating children's exposure as an adult? Have you talked about this, or is this maybe the first time that you're talking about it in this way? I'm just wondering kind of what your experience has been and whether you think it's important to talk about sort of the long-term experience of children's exposure. So let me know if you want to chime in and answer.
Well, this is David. I think all four of us have really talked today about it very much in the present tense, and
Yeah.
I mean, I love Sina's story about the wedding, and Ericka's story about Thanksgiving. I mean, I could totally picture a TV series about both of those, by the way. Because those are very much in the present, and I think that they are very much kind of a part of who we still are, too, and the kind of the strange, kind of ways that we've learned to survive and to be. It's become a part of our personalities, to kind of to be kind of hyper, kind of be peacemakers in our families, and so I think that's important. I think it's important to tell our stories in that way, because I like to sort of basically give the message that it's lifetime consequences, basically, and that it's not all bad either. I mean, so that I think some of us, obviously have coped in ways that are kind of wonderful, and healing and good for a lot of people, and I kind of really respect all of my co-panelists in that regard, is that we all have sort of taken pain and kind of learned from it, and I think have learned to channel it in ways that have been very constructive and useful. Oh, and you too, Casey. I kind of feel like you've been just wonderful and just have this wonderful ability to kind of process and to sort of add to what you've just heard, and so I really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks, David. No, and I'm so glad you're bringing that up. I can't believe I haven't said it earlier in the webinar about just that, we really embrace this growth model, and we really come from this project from the understanding that the things that we've learned and the things we've gained from these experiences are truly valuable and shape the way that we live our lives and shape a lot of the ways that we interact in the world and with our own families. And so there are certainly many strengths, lessons from the experience of navigating this, especially navigating it through different stages of life. So thanks for raising that, David. Others reflections on, whether it's important to talk about this as a lifelong process or how you talk about it?
I'll speak. This is Ericka. I obviously shared the Thanksgiving story. I really believe it's important for me, when I share my story, to share it both in past and in present tense. Because I think, especially from like an academic side of me, that when we talk about children's exposure, we're often talking about it as only childhood, and we're not talking about it through adulthood. And that was one of the things I know that brought us together, Casey, is this idea that we think it's there, it's this other place, and that it's not still presently with us, whether it's still actively going on or not, that it's just like this, it's exposure or exposed or witnessed, and that's this past tense. And so it's really important for me to make sure that it's present. I talk about it in present tense, and I talk about it as that it's actively going on, because exactly for what David said is that it's complex, and we're navigating it in all different ways, and it's not always all bad.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I should point out that Jessica posted in the text chat about how, the fact that many of us deal with PTSD can have positive outcomes too, right? She says it makes us more empathetic and approachable sometimes. And yes, and that's exactly what we're looking for, is what are the strengths and what are the things that we've gained from having had this experience, and how can we share those things with our audiences and tell our stories in a way that really illuminate those strengths. So, Sheena or Lenny, thoughts on telling the long-term story?
This is Sheena. I totally echo both what David and what Ericka have said. It's really important to me as well to share my experience, not only in the tense of childhood, but to also talk about it across that lifespan. Because for me, what it does is it provides insight and education to advocates when I'm doing, when I'm in the movement doing the work, about how resilience is built over the lifespan, or even in talking to survivors sometimes, how that resilience is built up, and there are positives that can come out of the experience along the way. So I think it's really important to talk about the violence and the healing, all of these things that we've discussed today across, in a context across the lifespan.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheena. Lenny, any additional thoughts before we move on to other questions?
I agree with what everyone is saying also. So I'll just say that.
Okay. So thanks for continuing to chat your questions, everyone. Kayla would like to know if we can speak more to how accountability looks different across cultures. So I wonder what panelists might want to speak to that.
This is Sheena. I think that accountability is going to look different based off of whatever culture it may be being experienced in. I know, as I mentioned, for me, there were times where the community's accountability of my father, whether that just be saying something to him to hold him accountable about his behavior, or, you know, reaching out to other folks to hold him accountable around his behavior. That was enough for me sometimes in community accountability, and in working with other communities in my role here, specifically in my work with African immigrant communities. I know that that is a model that many survivors in that community value as well. It may be taking things to the elders, and the elders holding folks accountable. So I think it looks different and can vary based on who the community is.
Yeah. Thank you, Tina. Other thoughts on Kayla's question?
Well, coming from the Native American perspective, I do agree with what Sheena's saying. One of the things that I've learned from elder advocates who have been doing this work even before I started to do this work, I always keep in mind what an elder said to me when she said, you should always keep your perpetrators accountable, and that's even by even saying their names in public. We still struggle, but we have gotten much more better within the Native community in regards to talking about, the many different forms of violence that impacts our community. So we're still learning, we're still growing, and it will get better. All the time.
Thanks, Lenny.
Yeah, and this is David. I think that, we're kind of overly reliant on the criminal justice system, in terms of accountability. And I think particularly for minority communities, Black men, Latino men, African American, Native American men are kind of overrepresented, obviously, in the criminal justice system. And so it sort of becomes punishment more than accountability. And so I like what Sheena said about kind of community accountability. And, I think that thinking about the role of, other agencies other than criminal justice, I think when I think about the African American community, I think about the church, for instance, and how kind of important that can be as a kind of a mechanism for accountability, and we actually have done a lot of presentations for churches and kind of, I think kind of what once clergy kind of gets it, sometimes they can be very instrumental in kind of providing guidance for abusers and even bringing them to programs, too. That's something that we've noticed. And so, yeah, I think just to sort of, again, more broadly conceptualize what accountability is. And when we talk with abusers in our program, we always make a point of asking them, how do they explain their situation to their family members? How much do they kind of like tell them why they're living apart from their partners, for instance, and because otherwise I think family members, if they don't get the full picture, might be blaming the victim in a lot of ways. And so part of taking responsibility, I think, is explaining the situation to your family members so they can sort of hold you accountable and support the changes that you're making.
Thanks, David. That's helpful. So I'm going to pose one more quick question, and then we will need to close. We're running short on time. But Megan is wondering, in what ways do your spouses or partners support your ongoing complex relationships with the person who's done you harm? So I don't know if anybody can speak briefly to that, ways in which your partner may support you in navigating that relationship.
That question came up in some of the work that I do when I talk about the abuse that I endured from my mother. My partner still gets really upset when he hears stories of what I and my other siblings experienced with my mother. and he gets angry. And I used to stop him from getting angry by, well, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't think that, until my own therapist told me that I was taking away his feelings and that I should allow him to feel his feelings. And if he does say those things, like something negative towards someone who was abusive or whatever, I just need to say thank you or, thanks for sharing. But I should never try to take away his feelings because I'm taking away his human emotions, is my understanding. So I allow him to say what he needs to say.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you, Lenny. Any other thoughts?
This is Sheena. For me, I think for my spouse, he respects kind of the decisions that I make in navigating that relationship. And then I also see him kind of absorbing how I navigate that relationship or how I kind of have handled things across my lifespan in navigating that relationship, and then takes those learnings and kind of apply or reflects on his own relationship with his family, with his parents. And I see where that has been a positive in the long run in kind of improving the overall relationship that he has. So I see him learning from some of the things that, that I do in navigating my relationship and also in just navigating our own relationship as well with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that as well in my partner. It's quite remarkable. Any other thoughts on this question before we close? Thank you so much, Megan, for posing that. And I did see that Jessica also shared a response. I appreciate all of you for kind of the peer support that I've seen through today's webinar. So I do want to express my deep gratitude to our panelists who have demonstrated such bravery and vulnerability and have just given us a true gift today in sharing their stories and experiences. So thank you to David, to Lenny, to Ericka, and to Sheena. I also want to thank my colleagues, Justine and Brecken, for your awesome work in supporting this webinar. We couldn't do this without you. And I want to express appreciation to Rochelle, who is our captioner for today's webinar, for helping us to make our webinar accessible to everyone. So thank you. Please continue to post any questions that you have. We will be following up with you in an email where we'll share the recording and related materials. And we would encourage you to please, as you leave, respond to our evaluation, as your feedback really does shape the direction that we move in. So thanks, panelists. Thanks, everybody. You've been wonderful. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.